Meet my mate Corey Bradshaw. Earlier this year, he came up with an unusual bet.
You know what? I bet I've got more Neanderthal in me than you have in you.
Now there's a challenge. Neanderthals first appeared across much of Europe and Asia around 400,000 years ago, while our species, Homo sapiens, evolved in Africa around 200,000 years ago. We began to spread out of Africa into Europe and Asia around 70,000 years ago, and the Neanderthals went extinct around 30,000 years ago. We don't really know what happened when Neanderthals encountered our invading ancestors, but we do know that some interbreeding happened between the two. We know that because many people across Europe and Asia today have a small percentage of Neanderthal DNA in their genes. There are various companies online who will send out test kits to analyse your DNA and tell you about your ancestry. Corey was born in Canada, but follows his family back to the British Isles, particularly Scotland, whereas all my known ancestors come from the south of England, and there is some claim to Jewish ancestry on my mother's side. So we may as well have a look into that while we're at it. But what we're really after is our Neanderthal DNA, and this company claims to uncover that too. Once ordered, the kits turned up within a week. So let's go and see Professor Bradshaw. Corey is Professor of Ecology at the University of Adelaide. Corey!
Hi, God.
How are you, mate?
Good.
It's straight down to business. The testing kits are relatively simple to use. You just have to fill a test tube with spit. A lot of spit. A very great deal of spit, in fact. But you have to fill to the dotted line. Then give it a shake and pop it in a bag to send off for analysis. One thing I'm curious about, Corey, the other night when we made the bet, you didn't tell me why you're interested in how much Neanderthal you've got.
Yeah, well, there are a lot of reasons. One is that Corey means troglodyte or cave dweller or ravine dweller, depending on the translation in Scottish Gaelic. So I've kind of always taken a bit of, pride in the fact that I might have a little bit more caveman in me than the average person. I think it would be fascinating to claim that you have a higher than average component of Neanderthal, or at least in this case, higher than you, Paul.
What about the other information that we can find out? You know, the deep matrilineal and the deep patrilineal family histories. Does that hold any interest for you?
Absolutely. I've always also been fascinated with Vikings. In fact, I've given myself a Viking name. It's Thorfinn Skullsplitter. And I am sure, being of Northern English on my father's side and Scottish descent on my mother's side, that there was a bit of Viking introgression going on there at some point in the past. Following the history of the British Isles, see how much of that crossed over into my own genome, I think is amazing.
And who do you think's going to win the bet?
I'm fairly confident. Although I've been thinking about this since we made the bet, and you actually look more like a Neanderthal than I do.
Yeah, thanks a lot. DNA genealogies have only been available within the last decade or so. But what do they really mean? What's the significance of how much Neanderthal DNA you have, and how reliably can DNA track the movement of your ancestors across the planet? To put family DNA into perspective, I'm off to see Professor Alan Cooper, an expert in DNA, particularly in what it says about our ancestry. What do you think of the quality of these kits that are available online to analyse your DNA?
Well, I don't think they're very precise in terms of calculating the proportions of different ancestry. And part of the problem for that is that the genetics are distributed across the landscape. So partly they tend to overestimate your ability to put the dot on the map for a certain percentage of your DNA. And then, secondly, as we get more information about the very complex history of human genomes and the interbreeding we've done with multiple other groups, Neanderthals, Denisovans, other things we can't even put a name to yet. We can tell they're there, but we can't even name them. They're so far back in time. The proportions and the interpretation of the markers changes subtly, but particularly in the basal aspects. So it's a work in progress, and it's very much a consumer product rather than an accurate one.
What are the results going to look like, and what are they going to mean? Am I going to get a percentage of how British I am? What does the rest of the percentage mean?
If it says something like you're 50% British, what it's doing is identifying genetic markers which are particularly common in Britain, but they're going to be everywhere else too. I mean, they're going to be, the Angles and the Saxons who've invaded England have brought in a lot of that DNA. So if it says 50%, it's just saying 50% of the markers that have been mapped so far in things that have been studied, mostly Europeans, the highest proportion of those particular markers are in the UK. The other 50% are scattered around all over the place, and we haven't found them yet.
And the DNA question, what is the significance of having a proportion of our DNA that actually derives from Neanderthals?
Well, we've all got Neanderthal DNA in us if we have ancestry from outside of Africa. Basically, as the modern human population came out of Africa, it interbred almost straight away with Neanderthal populations, potentially those in the Near East, before moving on to the rest of the world. Now, the studies we've done so far have shown at least 4 interbreeding events with Neanderthals and 1 with Denisovan. The DNA itself seems to be only a certain select set of genes. In other words, what crossed over from Neanderthal and mixed was then rapidly diluted out in subsequent generations, apart from a few bits that were actually useful. Some of it to do with immune system, but also some genes to do with skin, hair, appearances.
So what you're really telling me is that Corey and I are having a bit of fun, but we shouldn't take this too seriously.
Yeah, the genes that we share from the Neanderthals are all fairly conserved type things. There's nothing particularly interesting about them, and what you're picking up, the variation in how much you might have, is really related to those population areas that are most closely related to where the mixing has occurred, and then chance from that point forward. But it's not like there's any genes of real consequence that vary between individuals that are likely to have an effect that you can note in any way.
After 12 weeks, we both got our results delivered online, so I'm off back to see Corey. I found some surprises in my family tree. I wonder if he's found any in his. And just which one of us has the most Neanderthal DNA?
Hey,
Professor Bradshaw. How are you, bud? Good to see you. So, how did you go?
Well, as I predicted, having Scottish on my mother's side and Northern English on my father's, I suspected there would be quite a lot of Brit in there.
So how British are you?
It's 51.5%.
All right, I'm only 53.9, so I'm just a little bit more than you there.
Which is actually lower than I expected.
Did you get the Viking that you were after?
Yeah, so I was under the assumption that most of my ancestors would have been raped and pillaged by the Vikings. As it turns out, I'm actually rather low at only 3.9%. But you know what the real surprise was?
Yeah.
It's not the Vikings. It turns out I'm 1/15 Finnish.
Finnish?
And there is no record of that anywhere in the genealogy, mostly from my mother's line, in fact, which is a complete shock and mystery.
Well, my surprise is I'm almost 10% French.
Now, isn't that poetic genealogical justice?
All right, let's go for the big one.
All right.
I'll go first. It's a little under average. I'm 2.4% Neanderthal. What are you?
I am 3.0%. I am in the 89th percentile. I am very Neanderthal as people go, which makes me the winner. Yes, you have to pay.
End of story.